The old precinct smelled like stale coffee, forgotten ambition, and a metallic tang that Sergeant Elijah Vance tried, and failed, to attribute only to spilled cleaning fluid. A ghost scent, maybe, clinging to the brick walls of the town of Blackwood Creek. It was 2 a.m., and the dispatch call was routine. A welfare check at an isolated farmhouse 10 miles out, property of an elderly couple, the Millers, who hadn't answered their emergency line in 2 days. Vance, a man whose 47 years had etched lines of weariness deeper than his uniform creases, took the call. He paired up with Officer Kira Olson, fresh out of the academy, all nervous energy and textbook idealism. The drive was silent, save for the rhythmic squeak of a loose wiper blade against the light drizzle. Blackwood Creek was aptly named. The pines lining the highway were dense, black giants that ate the patrol car's headlights. "Ever been out to the Miller place, Olson?" Vance asked, his voice a low rumble. "No, Sarge. Just saw the file. They own that whole stretch of woods by the old quarry, right? Been there since the 50s. The Millers are fixtures," Vance confirmed. "And this is the third time this year the alarm company couldn't get a hold of them. Usually, it's a busted line. But tonight..." He trailed off. Tonight felt different. The air was too heavy, too quiet. They pulled onto a gravel driveway that was barely visible, overgrown with weeds. The Miller farmhouse was a dark, 2-story structure, its clapboard siding peeling like sunburnt skin. No lights were on. The silence here wasn't just lack of sound, it was an absence of sound, a vacuum that seemed to suck up the drizzle's gentle patter. Olson unclipped her radio. "Dispatch, we're on site at the Miller residence. No sign of activity. Going to approach." Vance killed the engine. The resulting darkness was absolute. As they stepped onto the damp porch, Vance saw it. Not a break-in, not a struggle. Just a detail that snagged his gut like a barbed wire fence. On the wooden railing, near the front door, sat a small, perfectly preserved ceramic bird, a blue jay. He knew Mrs. Miller collected those. But this one was wrong. Its paint was too bright, its position too deliberate, perched right on the edge. He tried the door. Locked. He rapped sharply. "Mr. Miller? Mrs. Miller? Blackwood Creek Police. We need you to open up." Only the echo of his knuckles against the wood answered. Olson shined her flashlight through the nearest window. The beam cut through the grime to reveal a living room frozen in time, a lace doily on a side table, a magazine laid open face down on a rocking chair, a grandfather clock standing silent in the corner. "It looks fine, Sarge," Olson whispered. "Just empty." Vance moved to the back door, Olson following close. They found the lock on the service entrance to the mudroom was older, weaker. Vance took a deep breath, raised a boot, and kicked. The wood around the bolt splintered with a sharp crack, and the door swung inward. The smell hit them immediately. It wasn't rot or death, but something worse, something organic and acrid, like burnt copper mixed with unwashed fear. They entered. The mudroom was spotless. No scattered shoes, no muddy boots. Just a clean concrete floor and a row of empty hooks. "Clear," Olson murmured, moving cautiously into the kitchen. The kitchen was clean, too. Almost sterile. Except for the refrigerator. A thick, viscous liquid, the color of dried wine, had dripped from the top shelf, down the white enamel, and pooled slightly on the linoleum floor. It wasn't blood, it was too dark, too dense. Vance drew his sidearm. "Olson, stay behind me. Don't touch anything." They proceeded slowly through the house. The tension built with every silent room they checked. The dining room, the den, the sunroom, all orderly, all devoid of life, but permeated by that sickening copper odor. Upstairs. The hallway was dark, the air suddenly much colder. Vance reached the master bedroom door. It was slightly ajar. He nudged it open with his foot. The room was neat. The bed was made. On the bedside table, 2 photographs faced out, Mr. and Mrs. Miller, smiling, decades younger, and then, Vance saw the second blue jay. It was resting on the pillow of Mrs. Miller's side of the bed. But this one was different from the one on the porch. this one wasn't ceramic. It was sculpted from something soft, waxy, and a pale, fleshy white. It was utterly, sickeningly, smooth. Its head was slightly tilted, as if listening. Olsen choked back a sound. Sarge, look at the wall. Vance followed her flashlight beam. Above the headboard, on the clean, pale wallpaper, was a single, perfect handprint. It was small, delicate, and stained the same dense, dried wine color that had dripped down the refrigerator, but the most chilling part was that the print wasn't flat. The skin of the palm was imprinted deeply into the wall, as if the wall itself were soft clay when the hand pressed there. The texture of the skin, the delicate lines of the fingerprint, were all rendered with impossible fidelity. It wasn't a stain. It was a scar. Vance raised his radio, his voice a strained whisper. Dispatch, we need a unit. And, a crime scene team. Possible missing persons, but I don't know what we're looking at. He turned back to the waxen blue jay. A tiny, almost invisible indentation ran along its back, like a seam. Suddenly, a floorboard creaked loudly, not in the room, but directly beneath them, in the dead space between the first and second floors. It was the sound of something heavy shifting. Olsen gasped, her flashlight beam shaking violently. What was that? The sound came again, a slow, deliberate scrape and drag, emanating from the very bones of the house. It was moving, not towards the stairs, but laterally, underneath the bedroom floor, heading for the far wall. Vance instinctively aimed his weapon at the floorboards, his knuckles white. Stay still, Olsen, he hissed. Don't move. Don't make a sound. The dragging stopped directly under the wall farthest from the door. A deep, wet thud echoed. Then, a slow, agonizing clicking sound started, like a tongue gently tapping against bone, coming from inside the wall itself. The sound grew louder, more frantic, and then settled into a repetitive, almost meditative rhythm. Click. 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 Olsen's breathing hitched. Sarge, look! The wallpaper directly over the source of the clicking, pristine moments before, began to stretch inward, slowly, as if a large, unseen fist was being pushed against it from the inside. A bulge formed, growing taut, and the handprint, the small, dried wine-colored handprint, now seemed to be sinking deeper into the wallpaper, as if resonating with the pressure from within the wall. The clicking stopped. The bulge in the wallpaper held, a taut, stomach-churning convexity above the miller's headboard. Vance stared at it, the sweat on his palms making his grip slick on his sidearm. Olsen. Back. Slow, Vance ordered, his voice barely a rasp. Olsen, her face pale under the cold wash of the flashlight, took one shaky step backward toward the bedroom door. The floorboards under her left foot let out a sudden, violent shriek. The bulge in the wall ruptured. It wasn't a violent tear, but a sickeningly smooth peeling. The wallpaper, and a thin layer of plaster beneath it, curled back like the skin of a bruised fruit, revealing a dark, vertical seam, and from that seam, a thick, glistening cable slid out. It wasn't electrical wire or plumbing. It was organic, the diameter of a man's wrist, covered in a sheer, moist membrane. It was the color of old, oxidized copper, the same hue as the mysterious liquid from the kitchen. It landed on the pristine pillow, coiling with a slow, deliberate momentum, right next to the pale, waxen bird sculpture. As the cable coiled, the clicking sound returned, emanating from its tip, which was flattened and rounded, like a large, polished tooth. Vance acted purely on reflex and training. Move. Now. He grabbed Olsen by the back of her vest and shoved her toward the door just as the cable whipped out, striking the spot where she had been standing on the floor. It hit with a damp, heavy impact that splintered the polished oak. They stumbled out into the hallway. Vance didn't look back until they reached the top of the stairs. He kept his weapon trained on the bedroom door, waiting for whatever was inside to follow. The silence returned, more absolute than before. Sarge, what was that? Olsen was hyperventilating, her flashlight beam dancing wildly on the landing. I don't know, Vance admitted, his chest heaving. But we are not going back in there until backup arrives. We need to secure the perimeter and figure out where that thing came from. They retreated downstairs and out the shattered mudroom door, catching their breath in the cold, drizzling air. Vance radioed dispatch again, his voice tight with controlled urgency, insisting on an immediate response and requesting a structural engineer alongside the crime scene unit. He reported possible hostile fauna and structural compromise. He couldn't bring himself to say, a copper-colored cable that came out of the wall and tried to kill us. They stood on the gravel driveway, the farmhouse now a silhouette of dread against the black woods. The basement, Olsen whispered, suddenly pulling her jacket tighter. The floorboard creaked beneath us, Sarge. And that dragging sound, it came from under the floor. Vance nodded, his mind racing. The Millers were gone. No sign of forced entry, no struggle, just impeccable neatness, two unsettling bird sculptures, the handprint, and whatever was now coiling in the dark upstairs. It suggested they hadn't been taken by force, but perhaps, absorbed. The basement access is usually through a hatch in the kitchen or an outside cellar door, Vance said. Let's check the exterior. If there's an entrance, we'll wait for the team there, keep an eye on it. They rounded the back of the house, heading towards the heavy brush and the tree-line. The ground here was soft, yielding. They found the cellar door, a heavy, rusted metal slab set flush against the foundation wall, half hidden by overgrown ferns. It looked like it hadn't been opened in decades. We wait, Vance said, planting himself 10 feet away, his back against a thick oak tree. When the unit gets here, we tell them to. He stopped. The metal cellar door, which had been perfectly flat, began to groan. It wasn't the sound of a latch being turned. It was the sound of internal pressure, of heavy metal warping. The center of the door began to bow outward, slowly, inexorably, as if being pushed by something massive and humid from beneath. A line of fine red rust and dirt traced the edge of the door, signifying the increasing tension. Olsen raised her flashlight, illuminating the door's surface, where the door had bulged. A circular patch, about the size of a dinner plate, began to change color. It darkened, not with shadow, but with saturation, becoming a deep, coppery red. And then, Vance saw what was happening. It wasn't rust. It was a web of fine, pulsating veins, visible just beneath the surface of the metal, spreading rapidly across the circle. The metal of the door was turning into skin. The sound of the approaching sirens, faint and distant, reached them, a desperate plea for normalcy in the utter horror that was unfolding feet away. The cellar door let out a final, tearing screech. The skin-like circle didn't burst open. Instead, it retracted cleanly, folding inward and downward, like a heavy, pink curtain being drawn in a bathtub, leaving a perfectly circular aperture, an open mouth, into the black earth below. From the hole, a rush of that metallic, acrid odor blasted out, accompanied by a sound unlike anything Vance had ever heard. It was a low, resonant hum, deep enough to vibrate the earth, mixed with hundreds of tiny, simultaneous, wet slurping sounds, and then, a faint, garbled whisper rode the wave of the putrid air, a woman's voice, distorted and stretched, like a recording played too slow. Elijah, it's so clean now, so quiet. It was Mrs. Miller's voice. And it was coming from the humming pit. Vance looked at Olsen, his face a mask of shock and resolve. Backup is almost here. Stay here. Do not engage. I'm going to cover the entrance. Before Olsen could protest, the faint siren sound grew louder, and from the black hole, in direct response to the approaching noise, a thick, glistening root, not a cable, but an actual root, mottled with copper and white, slithered out and hooked itself around the lip of the opening. It pulsed, ready to strike. The siren wail grew from a distant cry to a physical presence, slicing through the heavy, oppressive silence of the Millers' property. The first patrol car, a county sheriff's unit, skidded to a stop on the gravel 10 yards from Vance and Olsen. Two deputies, Ramirez and Cho, jumped out, weapons drawn and flashlights blazing. They saw the shattered mudroom door and the two Blackwood Creek officers standing frozen near the tree-line. Ramirez, the senior deputy, jogged over. Vance? What the hell is going on? Dispatch said, hostile fauna and structural. He stopped mid-sentence. His flashlight beam had swept over the foundation, settling on the impossibly transformed cellar door. The circle of what now looked like raw, pale pink scar tissue, the mouth, was still wide open, and the thick, copper-colored root was twitching, its tip poised like a serpent's head. The low, subterranean hum intensified, and the air around the open cellar reeked of iron and deep earth. "That," Vance said, his voice flat, pointing at the monstrous aperture, "is the access point." The millers' voices, or something mimicking them, came from down there. "And there's something in the house, too." It came out of the upstairs wall. Cho stared, visibly sickened, at the pulsing root. "That's not normal flora, Sergeant." "No kidding," Olsen muttered, finally lowering her own weapon, but keeping her hand hovering near the grip. Just then, the second wave of backup arrived, a fully equipped crime scene unit van, an unmarked detective's car, and a fire department emergency truck, which blocked the entire driveway. The small farm was suddenly flooded with strobing red and blue light. Cutting garishly through the darkness, Detective Lieutenant Marcus Finn, a man known for his cynical pragmatism, emerged from the unmarked car, coffee cup in hand. He took one look at the splintered door and the uniformed officer standing 10 feet back from an open hole in the foundation. "Vance, you drag us out of bed for a welfare check and a structural problem?" Finn started, already annoyed. Vance simply pointed with his chin toward the cellar door. Finn walked closer, squinting, then brought his flashlight to bear. He saw the fleshy, pink rim, the thick, metallic root, and the black, humming void. His coffee cup slipped from his fingers, hitting the gravel with a soft, dull thud. He didn't seem to notice. "What is that?" Finn breathed, finally recognizing the terrifying anomaly. "We need to get the thermal imaging up, Lieutenant," Vance said, recovering his composure. "And we need to get a drone or something non-living down that hole. I don't trust the stability of the entire structure." The crime scene team, led by a technician named Doyle, scrambled. Within minutes, a high-sensitivity thermal camera was aimed at the farmhouse. The thermal image displayed on Doyle's monitor was chilling. The whole house was cold, a uniform, dark blue. Except for one section, a diffuse, spreading patch of angry red heat, pulsating softly in the center of the basement, directly beneath where the cellar door lay open. And leading from that heat source, fine, faint red threads traced the routes of the house's beams, joists, and studs, as if the entire wooden skeleton were slowly being infused by a warm, alien blood. "The house is running a fever, Lieutenant," Doyle whispered, his eyes wide. As the team prepared a tethered camera to send into the cellar, the humming from the pit changed pitch. It became higher, tauter, like 1,000 taut piano wires being plucked simultaneously. The thick, copper-colored root, which had been resting, suddenly snapped to attention. It slammed down onto the gravel, not striking, but anchoring itself. Then, 2 more roots, thinner, pale white, and slick with the same viscous fluid that had been on the refrigerator, slithered out of the hole, searching the air blindly. Then, the second strange detail of the miller's disappearance was repeated. From the first-floor window, the light from the crime scene unit's powerful flood lamp shone into the dark living room. As the root pulsed below, the light from the lamp began to flicker inside the house. It wasn't a faulty bulb. The light itself seemed to be thinning, dissolving. Where the bright, clear beam had been, a creeping, viscous shadow now bled, consuming the photons. The light source was perfectly fine, but the light that entered the house was dying. The visible slice of the living room turned from white light to a deep, impenetrable violet, then to absolute, non-reflective blackness. Finn stared, speechless. "It's eating the light." A second later, Olsen pointed, her voice ragged. "Look up. The roof." They all tilted their heads back. The roof, which was shingled and relatively well-maintained, was beginning to weep. Not water, but the same dense, dried wine-colored liquid from the kitchen, slowly seeping between the shingles, forming thick, slow-moving rivulets. The structure was not just infected, it was exuding. It was breathing. It was alive. Before anyone could formulate an order, the central, copper-colored root gave a violent, powerful tug. With a massive, grinding sound that tore the earth, the entire rusted metal cellar door, warped and now covered in that network of pale veins, was hauled down into the black hole and vanished, the entrance collapsing and sealing itself with a wet, final suction sound. Like a massive wound closing, silence returned. But this time, it was the sound of a predator that had just swallowed its prey. The humming was gone. The only sound was the distant chirping of the night crickets and the frantic, horrified breathing of the police team. The light inside the house, now fully consumed, had not only vanished but seemed to have been replaced by a subtle, inverse luminosity. In the absolute, lightless dark of the miller's living room window, something was now faintly, sickly glowing, a soft, internal, copper-red pulsing, the heartbeat of the house itself. The sudden, soundless sealing of the cellar entrance shattered the remaining fragments of police procedure. The officers, trained for human threats and predictable crises, were now facing a problem of biology and architecture. Detective Lieutenant Finn was the first to regain control. He didn't shout, his voice was a low, dangerous growl. "Everyone. Perimeter back 50 yards. Doyle, keep that thermal running. Ramirez, Cho, secure the fire truck's biggest floodlights and aim them at the front door. We're cutting off all outside light sources to that thing." He paused, looking at the faintly copper-red glow now pulsing in the miller's windows, a subtle, rhythmic beat. "Vance, you and Olson. Gear up. We're breaching the main floor." Vance nodded, already moving toward the trunk of the patrol car to retrieve a heavy-gauge shotgun and a breaching axe. "Mudroom door is already compromised, Lieutenant. But we need to assume everything inside is a tripwire. The smell alone is a biohazard." Olson, her hands still trembling, was strapping on a gas mask. "The air is metallic and acidic, Sarge. It's not decomposing matter. It's fermentation." Finn grabbed a radio, his expression grim. "I want biocontainment teams here in 2 hours, full hazmat. Tell them to bring everything. And tell them to find the closest structural engineer who believes in fungal sentience. They'll need him." Vance and Olson, equipped with gas masks, body armor, and automatic weapons, approached the splintered mudroom door. The outside lights, now focused exclusively on the building, turned the porch into a sickly, yellow-white stage. The mudroom floor was slick with the copper-red fluid, reflecting the artificial light like a puddle of blood. Vance kicked the broken door aside. The mudroom smelled worse than any crime scene, a blend of raw copper, spoiled meat, and ozone. "Clear," Vance reported, his voice muffled by the mask. They moved into the kitchen, the room of the clean knife and the perfectly organized pantry. But the floorboards beneath their boots now felt spongy, giving slightly with each step, and the surface was sticky. The refrigerator, still oozing, had a darker, more vibrant copper stain running from its base toward the dining room entrance. "The whole ground floor is being saturated," Olson hissed over the radio channel connecting their masks. "It's using the house's bones like capillaries." They reached the foot of the main staircase. The hallway was pitch black, a pocket of the house that seemed to have completely consumed the available light, but the thermal camera, relayed to Finn and Doyle outside, painted a horrific picture. The copper cable, which Vance had seen in the upstairs bedroom, was no longer confined to the wall. It was now a thick, pulsing route that ran down the center of the staircase, branching out along the baseboards like a river system. The heat signatures showed that the entire wooden structure was a warm, interconnected network. It centralized the infestation, Vance realized, raising his rifle. The center of the house is the center of the organism. As he stepped toward the stairs, a new sound emerged from the darkness of the second floor. It was a rapid, wet thrumming, like a dozen heartbeats working overtime. And then, a new voice, clearer than Mrs. Miller's garbled whisper, echoed down the stairwell. "The quiet is lovely, isn't it? Vance. You should join us." It was a man's voice, calm, resonant, and utterly wrong. "Mr. Miller," Vance ignored the terror coiling in his gut. "We're going up. Olson, cover the landing. I'm taking point." They mounted the first few stairs. The wood groaned not under their weight, but as if in complaint. When they were halfway up, the pulsing root on the baseboard, which had been dormant, began to split. It wasn't a clean tear. The fibrous outer layer parted, and from the opening, dozens of fine, hair-thin tendrils shot out. They moved with impossible speed, binding themselves to the doorknobs and doorframes of the downstairs rooms, securing the entries like living latches. Suddenly, the floor of the landing above them shimmered. The hardwood planks began to separate, not along the grain, but at the junctions. They curled upward like stiff ribbons, revealing a layer beneath, a thick, wet mat of black, spongy moss, vibrating intensely. The sound of the thrumming heartbeats was coming from this layer. A shadow detached itself from the wall near the miller's bedroom door. It was vaguely humanoid, the height of a man, but its form was fluid, barely more than a ripple in the absolute blackness. It shuffled toward them, dragging a long, heavy shape. "Contact!" Olsen shouted, raising her weapon. The shadow moved into a sliver of light from Vance's flashlight beam. The shape resolved itself into a grotesque, moving sculpture. It was a man-sized effigy, crudely formed from what looked like dried mud and copper-colored plaster. Its face was a smooth, featureless dome. It held the heavy shape not as a weapon, but as a child might hold a doll. As it raised the shape, Vance and Olsen flinched. The object was a bird sculpture, identical in shape to the one in the bedroom, but this one was 4 feet long, covered in matted human hair, and weeping the red liquid from its polished, waxen eyes. "Hold fire!" Vance yelled, recognizing the pattern. "It's trying to." Before he could finish, the figure flung the enormous bird at them. Vance ducked, but Olsen, trying to move back, slipped on the sticky floor. The bird struck the railing of the staircase with sickening force, shattering into fragments of plaster, hair, and bone. The copper cable on the wall screamed. It was a high-pitched, tearing sound, like metal shearing under immense pressure. Simultaneously, the spongy moss on the landing rushed toward the edge, cascading over the step and pouring down like a black, viscous waterfall. "Up! Up! Don't let it touch you!" Vance roared, firing a burst from his rifle at the advancing ooze, the shots doing nothing more than splashing the thick substance. They scrambled up the last steps, the floor of the landing already closing beneath the black moss. They reached the hallway, their boots sinking slightly into the wet, fleshy carpet of the living house, leaving clean, non-infected prints in their wake. They were trapped on the second floor. "Sarge," Olsen stammered, pointing a shaking hand toward the master bedroom. "Look!" The doorway to the miller's room was now a solid, uniform surface of that pale, copper-veined skin. But in the very center of the door, where the doorknob used to be, a pair of pristine white, waxen hands had pushed out of the surface, palms open. They were the hands of Mrs. Miller, perfect and serene, offering an invitation to the pulsing darkness within. Vance lifted his rifle and aimed it at the center of the strange, pale hands protruding from the skin-sealed doorway. Olsen, recovering from her fall, trained her own weapon. "Don't shoot," Vance suddenly rasped into his comms. "It's a decoy, or a lure. The hands are wax. They're too clean. That thing, that clay figure, it's using their forms as bait." The hands, frozen in a gesture of serene invitation, were indeed perfect, but lifeless. The skin around them throbbed, reflecting the copper-red glow that permeated the second-floor hallway. "We have to get in," Vance decided, clipping his rifle to his vest and pulling the heavy breaching axe from his belt. "This is the source on this level." He approached the door cautiously. The skin-like material was taut and surprisingly warm to the touch. It felt like densely packed connective tissue, not wood or plaster. Vance raised the axe high. "Stand back, Olsen. This is going to be messy." He brought the axe down with all his force. Instead of a splintering crack, the impact was met with a dull, wet thud and a spray of warm, thick, copper-colored fluid. The axe head sank into the yielding surface as if into a side of raw beef. The two waxen hands immediately snapped inward and vanished, absorbed instantly back into the membrane, leaving the wound to bleed and slowly, visibly, begin to knit itself closed. Vance grunted, wrenching the axe free and striking again, harder, tearing a jagged, smoking hole in the organic seal. The stench of metallic ozone intensified, searing their lungs even through the gas masks. The hole was wide enough. Vance plunged through, Olsen right behind him. The master bedroom was bathed in a deep, copper-red light, emanating from the center of the ceiling where the light fixture had been replaced by a pulsating, bioluminescent sac. The air was thick, heavy with the sound of the house's rhythmic thrumming. The room was no longer a bedroom. It was a macabre, organic gallery. The furniture was gone, absorbed. The walls and ceiling were now entirely covered in the same pulsating, veined skin, but stretched tight and glossy, reflecting the sickly red light, and in the center of the room stood the Millers. They were not alive, nor were they dead in the conventional sense. they were part of a horrifying sculpture. Mr. Miller's form was fused to the wall, his limbs stretched thin and rigid, his torso barely a bulge in the surface, but his face, his head, was still recognizable, his eyes wide and staring at the ceiling sack. Mrs. Miller was similar, fused to the opposite wall, her body distorted into a flowing, organic line. Their bodies were used as the armature for the structure. Thick, copper-colored roots sprouted from their mouths and eye sockets, anchoring them to the core of the infection. The roots led, like feeding tubes, to a central installation in the far corner. This installation was a low, undulating mound of that black, spongy moss, identical to the moss on the stairs, but massive. It was humming and vibrating, clearly the core of the fever detected on the thermal imaging. From its sides, dozens of the pale, waxen bird sculptures, like the one Vance had seen, were growing, slowly being extruded from the mossy pulp. They were the fruit of the house, but the worst detail wasn't the Millers or the grotesque sculptures. It was the figure standing beside the mound that it was a young man, dressed in tattered, damp clothing that looked like a long-forgotten gardener's uniform. He was slender, pale, and covered in thin, shimmering film of the copper fluid. He held a small, delicate spade in his hand, its metal surface glowing with the same internal red light that he was tending the mound, meticulously trimming a root that was growing too close to one of the bird sculptures. He looked up at Vance and Olsen, his eyes calm, clear, and disconcertingly intelligent that he didn't speak with his mouth. The voice of Mr. Miller, the calm, resonant voice, emanated from the young man's chest. "Ah, you've met the parents. They're finally quiet. They never understood the necessity of clean lines, of perfect silence. But the material remembers. And the house is an excellent medium." Vance raised his rifle, sighting the figure. "Police! Drop the weapon and put your hands up." The young man didn't move, barely blinking. He looked at Vance with an expression of profound, weary pity. "You still think in terms of police and weapons," the voice sighed, still emanating from his chest. "I'm not armed, Sergeant Vance. I am merely the gardener. And this is the harvest." He lifted the small spade and gently scraped a minute shard of the Miller's flesh from the wall, adding it to the mossy mound. The mound pulsed, satisfied. Vance squeezed the trigger, the rifle spat fire. But the bullets didn't hit the gardener. They hit the air 3 feet in front of him and stopped. The bullets were instantly enveloped by a translucent, shimmering membrane that formed, impossibly fast, between the gardener and Vance. They hung suspended in the coppery film, turning black as they were instantly consumed, their kinetic energy absorbed. The gardener smiled, a small, sad gesture. "The house has thick skin now, Vance. It wants you to stay and be part of the collection." He pointed the small, glowing spade toward the shattered hole they had made in the bedroom entrance. The hole, which had been slowly clotting, suddenly exploded outward with hundreds of hair-thin, copper-red rootlets, blocking their only escape. The gardener took a step back toward the central mound, now humming with a triumphant intensity. He looked directly into Vance's eyes. "The Millers were loud, but you brought the light. And the material loves light. I think you'll make a beautiful centerpiece." Vance didn't hesitate. Recognizing the futility of ballistic force against the protective membrane, he lunged to the side, grabbing the breaching axe he'd dropped. "Olsen! Get to the window. We're going through the wall." Vance yelled into his comms. The gardener, standing serenely by the humming moss mound, tilted his head. "Axe? That's messy. And the glass is thick here, Sergeant. Built to keep the sound out, and the light in." The rootlets blocking the doorway writhed, thickening instantly, weaving themselves into a solid, impenetrable wall of pulsing copper fiber. Olsen, her breath ragged, raced to the single window, smashing her rifle butt against the glass. The heavy, old-fashioned glass barely scratched. "It won't break, Sarge. It feels reinforced." The floor beneath them began to undulate. Thick veins of copper appeared in the spongy, wet carpet, tracing routes from the central mound outward. The entire room was becoming a circulatory system. "The core!" Vance roared, pointing the axe at the gardener. "He's drawing power from that mound." He charged, dodging a sudden, violent lash from one of the roots that had snaked out from Mr. Miller's fused form on the wall, the gardener watched him approach with the detached interest of a biologist observing a frantic insect. As Vance closed the distance, the membrane shimmered again, but this time, it didn't just stop the axe. It created a repulsion field. The moment the axe head met the air, it struck an invisible shield. A blinding flash of pale, caustic light erupted, throwing Vance backward and sending a jolt of painful static electricity through his body armor. He slammed against the wall, his vision momentarily swimming. Olsen acted on instinct. Dropping her useless rifle, she drew her taser. If it absorbs kinetics, let's see how it handles raw current. She aimed for the gardener's chest and squeezed the trigger. The twin barbs shot out, trailing their conductive wires. The barbs struck the gardener. Not the membrane, but his wet, tattered uniform. A massive, brilliant blue-white arc of electricity flashed, encompassing the gardener in a blinding sphere of pure energy. The sound was a sharp, concussive crack that momentarily drowned out the house's thrumming heartbeat. The gardener stood rigid, absorbing the full blast. His form didn't twitch, but the mossy mound behind him let out a high-pitched, tearing shriek. The pale, waxen bird sculptures growing from the mound began to shake violently. The intense current overloaded the immediate defense mechanism. The shimmering membrane around the gardener collapsed, turning into a cloud of sizzling, acrid vapor. The gardener's eyes finally showed pain. He looked down at the wires trailing from his chest, an expression of profound irritation crossing his face. Poor etiquette. The material is very sensitive to heat shock. Before Olsen could react, the gardener raised his hands. The copper-red light in the room surged, reaching a blinding crescendo. The waxen bird effigies on the mound didn't melt or burn. They hatched, the wax surfaces cracked, and from the broken shells, something small, pale, and impossibly fast emerged. They weren't birds, but pale, hairless creatures the size of large rats, with wide, gaping mouths lined with hundreds of tiny, obsidian-black teeth. They were utterly silent, moving with a slick, terrifying speed. A swarm of perhaps 50 of these nascent collectors boiled off the mound and rushed across the floor toward the two officers. Vance, recovering, saw the creatures and knew simple retreat was impossible. They were too fast. He grabbed a fire extinguisher from the wall bracket, noted how the bracket was already weeping copper fluid, and ripped the device off the wall. Olsen. Cover your face. Thermic shield. Vance pulled the pin and aimed the extinguisher at the advancing swarm. The cloud of freezing cold chemical suppressant erupted, hitting the creatures full force. The intense cold did what the bullets and axe could not. It caused the organic matter to instantly solidify and shatter. The ground became littered with fragments of pale, brittle, frozen tissue. The gardener screamed, a genuine, piercing cry of rage that was not Mr. Miller's voice, but a young, high-pitched shriek of pure, petulant agony. My beautiful flock! You destroy the material. The house responded immediately. The walls rippled violently. The rootlets sealing the doorway retracted momentarily, then shot across the room, bypassing Vance, and wrapped around Olsen's legs, lifting her clean off the ground. Vance spun, firing his rifle, now loaded with slug rounds, at the exposed roots, hoping the heavy impact would sever them. The slugs tore through the fibers, freeing Olsen, who hit the spongy floor hard. The window, Vance. Now! Olsen yelled, realizing they had maybe 5 seconds before the remaining creatures regrouped and the gardener recovered. Vance didn't need to be told twice. He raised the heavy breaching axe, now covered in sticky, copper residue, and hammered it with desperate force into the wall beside the sealed window. Not the glass, but the plaster, the studs, and the underlying material. Crack. The wood fought back. Crunch. The wall structure was dense, saturated. Smash. On the fourth blow, the saturated wood and plaster gave way. Vance didn't breach the window. He tore a jagged, man-sized hole clean through the exterior wall, revealing the chaotic, flashing emergency lights outside. Vance grabbed Olsen, pulling her toward the opening. As he shoved her through the gap, he looked back. The gardener was standing over the damaged mound, his hands glowing fiercely red, healing the wound of the taser. His eyes met Vance's, no longer showing pity, but a cold, focused fury. "You are outside, Sergeant," the gardener whispered, his voice dangerously soft, radiating from the floor itself. "But the house extends beyond the foundation. The material is in the soil. And the soil is patient." Vance vaulted through the gap, landing hard on the damp, shrub-filled ground below. He looked back up. The gardener was already gone, dissolved into the pulsing red darkness of the room. But the hole they'd made in the wall was visibly, rapidly, being covered by a network of white, fleshy strands, weaving themselves into a tight, organic seal. They had escaped the room, but the house was sealing itself, taking its terrible secret and its captive inside. And now, Vance knew the creature was not contained, it was merely replanting itself. Vance and Olsen scrambled away from the farmhouse, running toward the brilliant, chaotic glare of the emergency lights. They tore off their damaged gas masks, gulping down the cool, drizzle-soaked air, which now tasted miraculously clean compared to the cloying atmosphere inside. Lieutenant Finn and Deputy Ramirez rushed to meet them, guns still drawn, their faces pale with shock. "Report, Vance. What the hell was that light show? And what is that?" Finn demanded, pointing back at the second-story wall, which was already patched with a sickening, white, fibrous scab. "It's alive, Lieutenant." "The house is an organism," Vance gasped, supporting Olsen, who was favoring her ankle. "It absorbed the millers. They're fused into the walls. We encountered the entity, a young male, calls himself the gardener. He's protected by some kind of force field, absorbs kinetic energy. He's cultivating the structure." Finn's face tightened with disbelief, but the evidence, the scarred wall, the odor, the terrified professionalism of his officers, forced acceptance. "Ramirez. Extend the perimeter tape another 50 yards. Cho, get the fire chief on the line. I need high-pressure water cannons, and I want them pointed at the foundation. We're treating this as a biohazard containment failure." As the team frantically adjusted the perimeter, Doyle, the crime scene technician, approached Vance, his eyes wild behind his protective glasses. He was holding a small, silver soil probe used for ground analysis. "Sergeant, you need to see this," Doyle whispered, pulling Vance aside toward the tree-line. "When the cellar door was open, I dropped this down. It wasn't just checking for stability. It's got a soil density sensor." Doyle tapped the screen. The graph showed a spike of impossible density near the foundation. "I ran a second, wider scan here, 10 feet out, in the garden where Mrs. Miller grew her roses. The new graph was worse. It showed the soil density wasn't natural. It was almost solid, a dense, interwoven mass that dropped several meters below the surface. The soil isn't soil, Sergeant. It's too structured." "I pulled a sample," Doyle said, pulling out a sealed clear bag. Inside the bag was a clumpy mass that looked like black earth. But on closer inspection, it was composed almost entirely of fine, dark, root-like tendrils, woven together so tightly they formed a flexible, living mat. They weren't tree roots, they were the same fibrous material that had sealed the door, but smaller, dormant, and completely covering the ground. "The gardener told me the material is in the soil, Lieutenant," Vance confirmed, handing the sample to Finn, who recoiled slightly. "He's not just cultivating the house. He's cultivating the whole property." A sudden, sharp cry ripped through the night. "Sarge! The thermal!" Olsen, hobbling over to the thermal monitor Doyle had set up, pointed with a shaking finger. The thermal image of the house was still an angry red heat source, but now, fine, luminous red lines were radiating outward, not in the air, but beneath the ground, tracing the paths of the driveway, the tree-line, and the perimeter fence. The lines were moving, growing. "It's mobilizing the root system," Vance concluded, feeling a wave of icy dread. The house wasn't isolated. It was the flowering body of a massive, subterranean fungus or organism. Suddenly, Deputy Cho, who was running the perimeter line 50 yards away near the entrance to the driveway, let out a strangled, terrified scream. "Ah! My leg! Get it off me! Get it off!" The team spun around. Cho had fallen, his flashlight rolling away. he was frantically clawing at the ankle of his boot that in the flash of the distant patrol car lights, they could see it. A single, thick, copper-colored root, much larger than the ones in the house, had surged up through the gravel of the driveway, bypassing the dense mat of fine roots, and was now wrapped around Cho's lower leg like a living boa constrictor. It was pulsing fiercely, drawing him down. Ramirez instinctively ran toward his partner. "Hold still, Cho. I'll..." "Cut it. Don't touch it, Ramirez." Vance screamed, remembering the caustic effect of the taser. "Use fire. Anything hot." But it was too late. Before Ramirez could reach him, the root gave a massive, powerful tug. Cho's scream was cut short as he was dragged off the surface. A patch of gravel and soil exploded outward, and the deputy vanished completely into a self-sealing hole in the driveway. The gravel settled back immediately, leaving only a faint tremor and the acrid smell of ozone hanging in the air. Silence fell, thick and absolute. They were standing on an infested graveyard. Finn gripped his radio, his face pale with horror and rage. "Get everyone back. We're evacuating the entire area. No one stays on the ground. This is not containment. This is a siege. Get the goddamn armored vehicles here now. We are not going to be pulled into the dirt." Vance looked at the thermal image again. The pulsing red lines were now growing rapidly toward the main road, hungry for new ground. He looked at the sealed farmhouse, the gardener's beautiful, silent masterpiece. The entity wasn't just collecting victims, it was expanding its consciousness through the earth itself. Finn's command to evacuate triggered immediate, panicked action. The officers sprinted toward the line of vehicles, their training overridden by the visceral terror of the ground itself turning hostile. Vance and Olsen, favoring Olsen's injured ankle, ran alongside Finn and Ramirez. Doyle, clinging to his thermal monitor, kept shouting readings. "It's accelerating. The heat lines are running along the pavement now. Get off the ground." The patrol car that had brought Vance and Olsen, parked closest to the tree line, was the first casualty. Before Ramirez could reach the driver's side, a half-dozen copper roots, thick and glistening, erupted from the gravel driveway beneath the car's chassis. They didn't strike the tires, they snaked around the axles and engine block, clamping down with tremendous, silent force. The entire vehicle shuddered violently, its dome light flashing erratically as the roots began to fuse with the metal, the copper fluid running down the doors. The crime scene unit van, a heavy, tethered vehicle, suffered the same fate. Its wheels sank slightly into the rapidly softening asphalt as massive, rope-like roots coiled around its tires, anchoring it firmly to the infected ground. "Forget the cars," Finn roared, pulling out a smoke grenade. "Get to the fire truck. We need elevation." The fire truck, the largest vehicle, was the last hope. The fire chief, a man named Henderson, was already moving, aiming the high-pressure turret on the roof. Following Finn's earlier, desperate order, Henderson opened the valve. A massive column of high-velocity water slammed into the foundation of the Miller farmhouse, intended to blast the organism off the wall. The reaction was instantaneous and terrifyingly counterproductive. The water didn't cleanse the copper skin, it seemed to feed it. Where the water struck, the surface of the house didn't break or erode. Instead, it glowed with a sudden, violent, sickly green phosphorescence. The skin on the foundation swelled rapidly, growing thicker and harder, like a fungal bloom on fast forward. The water had provided the moisture the subterranean structure craved. "Stop the water. Now. It's reacting." Vance screamed over the noise. Henderson frantically cut the flow. The swelling stopped, leaving the house even more resilient than before. The momentary distraction cost them. 3 thick, powerful roots, each as wide as a utility pole, erupted from the middle of the driveway. They didn't target the men, they targeted the vehicle's mobility. 2 roots wrapped around the fire truck's front bumper, immobilizing it. The third smashed into the engine block of Detective Finn's unmarked sedan, instantly killing the power and twisting the metal into a knot. They were stranded. Surrounded by a fleet of police vehicles now being consumed by the organic defense system. "Ramirez. We retreat to the main road, on foot. Use the tree line for cover," Finn commanded, grabbing a medical kit from his wrecked sedan. Vance, cover our rear. Doyle, keep tracking those thermal lines. The team plunged into the chaotic darkness of the surrounding woods. The tree-line was 50 yards of dense, rain-slicked forest floor. Every footfall was a gamble, the fear of the roots erupting beneath them absolute. As they fled, Doyle's voice crackled over the radio, his tone unnervingly flat. Lieutenant, the heat lines are now running parallel to us, they're moving faster than we are. They're surrounding the tree-line, they're using the old fence wire as a conduit. They reached the edge of the woods, stumbling onto the two-lane Blackwood Creek Road. They had made it. 30 feet of solid, black tarmac separated them from the deadly soil. Vance was the last one out of the woods, panting, his rifle raised. He glanced back at the abandoned cluster of lights and metal, already half consumed by the copper growths, from the upstairs window, now fully sealed and faintly glowing. A small, dark shadow resolved itself against the inner light. It was the gardener. He was standing perfectly still, a hand raised in a small, dismissive gesture. The voice of Mr. Miller, clear and mocking, drifted across the intervening space, seemingly carried by the earth itself. Such chaos. Such wasted energy. Why run, when you could simply be quiet and clean? Vance turned his back on the house and ran onto the road, joining Olson, Finn, and the others. Clear the road. We need to stop those lines before they cross. Finn yelled, shining his powerful flashlight down the empty asphalt, but it was too late. 50 feet ahead of them, where the road curved gently, the smooth black asphalt was buckling. A series of small, rapid cracks spread outward, like fissures on drying skin. With a sound like tearing canvas, the asphalt ripped open. Not one, but a cluster of thick, copper-colored roots surged from the crack, writhing like a nest of vipers, completely blocking the road. The gardener had anticipated their move. The infection had reached the main road, cutting off their escape. They were trapped between the growing, conscious house and the miles of infected road. The true scope of the entity's patient, subterranean conquest was now horrifyingly clear. The sight of the asphalt tearing open and the copper roots surging through solidified the reality. They were completely encircled. The silence of the forest was replaced by the low, guttural thrumming of the expanding root system beneath the tarmac. Lieutenant Finn pressed his back against a utility pole, his face grim under the flashing emergency lights that still pulsed uselessly from the abandoned vehicles. Doyle, status of the thermal lines? They've reached the tree line behind us and spread 20 feet down the road, Lieutenant, Doyle reported, his voice high-pitched with strain. We're trapped in a pocket. The material is too dense to cross. We can't wait for backup, Vance interjected, reloading his rifle with his remaining slugs. It took Cho in seconds. We saw the gardener's weakness, heat shock. The taser overload, the freezing extinguisher. The house doesn't like rapid thermal change. Finn nodded sharply, his decision made. Ramirez, we need fuel. The fire truck. There has to be something flammable in that rig. Vance, you and Olson create a diversion. We burn a path through those roots on the road. Ramirez, a tall man of action, raced back toward the nearest patrol car, risking the short run across the contaminated gravel. He returned moments later, his uniform stained with copper residue, carrying 2 punctured 5-gallon cans of spare gasoline from the truck supply. This is all I could get without getting anchored, Ramirez reported, panting. And a flare gun. It'll have to do, Vance said, his mind already calculating the risk. Olson, provide overwatch. If anything moves from the woods, you target the roots at the base. Aim for density. Vance and Ramirez advanced toward the roadblock of writhing copper roots 50 feet down the road. The roots were still growing, forming a dense, waist-high barrier. The air around them grew thick, saturated with the acrid, metallic smell. As they began to pour the gasoline over the writhing barrier, the house seemed to anticipate their intent. From the core of the roots on the road, a thick, yellow-white vapor began to hiss out, smelling strongly of ether and ammonia. Gas! Get back! Vance yelled, pulling Ramirez back toward the utility pole. The vapor was not a natural defense. It was a pre-ignition fuel. The gardener wasn't trying to suffocate them, he was turning the road into a bomb. ready to ignite the moment they used the flare. "Sarge, look!" Olsen shouted, pointing at the woods behind them. The black, spongy moss that had sealed the staircase was now flowing out of the tree-line, a slow, viscous tide creeping onto the dry asphalt behind them, cutting off their return route to the house. The entity was actively shrinking their safe zone. Vance knew they had only one chance. They had to ignite the roots before the volatile vapor collected too much, risking an uncontrolled detonation, but they also had to create a clean burning barrier. Ramirez, one flare. Hit the center line. As soon as it ignites, we run through the gap. Full sprint. Don't look back. Ramirez nodded, his hand shaking slightly as he aimed the flare gun at the center of the gasoline-soaked, vapor-shrouded copper roots. He pulled the trigger, the flare struck the mass with a sizzle, the entire root barrier erupted in a massive, roaring inferno. The yellow vapor, the gasoline, and the organic material itself caught fire instantly, creating a towering, opaque wall of intense, blistering heat. The flames were a savage, sickly green and orange, and the sound was a continuous, high-pitched screaming, the sound of the roots reacting to the thermal shock, a collective, unnatural wail. "Go! Go!" Finn screamed. They broke into a desperate sprint toward the firewall. The heat was immense, even 30 feet away, blasting through their clothing. As they neared the flames, Vance saw a horrifying detail. Within the roaring, burning root structure, small, luminous spheres of light were popping and dissolving. They weren't sparks, they were fleeting images. For a split second, Vance saw the clear, terrified face of Deputy Cho, and then the gentle, smiling face of Mrs. Miller, before the image exploded into green smoke. The roots were burning away the entity's memories or trophies stored within the fibers. They ran through the intense heat, the smoke choking them, the screams of the burning roots deafening. They emerged on the other side, momentarily stunned, coughing violently, their clothes smoldering. They had breached the main containment. Looking back, the inferno was still raging, the roots writhing in their final, fiery death throes. But as the heat started to die down, Vance noticed something else. Where the burning roots met the asphalt, the heat had been so intense that the asphalt hadn't just cracked, it had been melted and fused to the surrounding gravel, creating a glass-like barrier. A scar. They ran, not toward civilization, but just away from the immediate infection zone, running blindly down the desolate Blackwood Creek Road. As they rounded a corner, the radio crackled. It wasn't one of them. It was a cold, calm voice, slightly distorted, carrying the weight of distance and power. "You are not gone, Sergeant Vance. You are simply on the outside skin. And I have many roots, heading for many quiet places. You should have stayed and been made clean." The voice cut out. Vance stopped, looking back at the dark road. The gardener was no longer confined to the house. He was speaking through the airwaves, through the infrastructure of the surrounding county. He was everywhere. They staggered down the road, away from the smoke and the blinding emergency lights of the abandoned vehicles. Finn immediately took charge of the remaining four: Vance, Olsen, Ramirez, and Doyle. The radio, Finn rasped, coughing the last of the acrid smoke from his lungs. He spoke over the radio. "That means the material, or whatever consciousness he is, has integrated with the infrastructure. We can't use our mics." Vance nodded grimly, already stripping the battery from his damaged radio unit. "He said he has roots heading for many quiet places. He's not just interested in the property, he's interested in isolation and the infrastructure that connects it." They found a single, operational police cruiser battery on the side of the road, having likely been shaken loose from one of the disabled cars. Doyle, the technician, quickly jury-rigged a direct line connection to a recovered satellite phone from the CSI van, a closed, private network not tied to the local precinct's compromised repeaters. Finn initiated the call, bypassing the local dispatch and going straight to the Regional State Police Command, Captain Eleanor Hayes. "Captain Hayes, this is Lieutenant Finn. We have an active, severe biostructural incident at the Miller residence, Blackwood Creek. I am declaring a complete Level 5 containment zone. I need military support, hazmat, and heavy-duty thermal imaging on site immediately," Finn dictated, his voice regaining its authority. Hayes's voice crackled through the small speaker, sharp and disbelieving. Marcus, what the hell are you talking about? Level 5? You lost a deputy, but your report is riddled with phrases like organic infestation and sentient structure. You sound insane. I don't care what I sound like, Captain, Finn cut her off, his eyes scanning the surrounding woods, expecting the roots to surge from the dark. The house is a massive organism, and it's spreading underground. It consumes human beings and integrates them into its structure. We had to use fire to escape. We are currently trapped on Blackwood Road. Vance grabbed the phone. Captain, this is Sergeant Vance. The entity, the gardener, is targeting places where people can be quietly absorbed. Not crowds. He mentioned quiet places. We need to identify all isolated, infrastructure-dense locations in the county immediately. A terrible realization hit Finn. The old reservoir pumping station, he muttered, grabbing the phone back. It's 10 miles further down this road. Completely isolated, abandoned in the 90s, but it's where all the county water lines converge. It's nothing but pipes, valves, and tunnels. Pipes and tunnels, the perfect medium for a root system, Doyle finished, his eyes widening. They needed transport, but all their cars were gone. Suddenly, a sound cut through the tense silence, the deep, rhythmic growl of a diesel engine. A utility truck, bearing the logo of the Regional Electric Power Company, EPC, slowly approached them, coming from the direction of the town. Stay down, Finn commanded, shoving the officers into the roadside ditch. We don't know if that truck is compromised. The EPC truck, driven by a solitary, tired-looking worker in neon safety gear, slowed as it approached the knot of heavily armed officers hiding in a ditch. Vance watched the truck, focusing on the tires and the undercarriage. No signs of the copper fluid, no strange growths. It was clean. Finn stood up, stepping into the road, waving his hands. Stop! Police! We need this vehicle. The worker, startled, slammed on the brakes. As he did, he reached for his radio microphone. Dispatch, I've got officers blocking the road, looks like some kind of, oh, wait a minute, before the worker could say another word, a thin, lightning-fast root, no thicker than a pencil, but tipped with a razor-sharp bone-white barb, shot out from the interior of the utility pole right next to the truck. It struck the EPC worker through his open side window, piercing his neck. The worker slumped over the steering wheel, his microphone falling to the floor. The lights on the utility pole flashed violently, and the entire pole let out a low, vibrant hum. The gardener wasn't just using the ground, he was using the power grid, the miles of buried cable and the network of utility poles, as his nervous system. He's everywhere, Olsen yelled. He waited for the medium. The truck, now driverless, slowly began to roll forward. Too thick, copper roots immediately sprouted from the asphalt and began to snake toward the engine block and the fuel tank. We take the truck. Now! Vance sprinted toward the passenger door. They scrambled into the cab of the truck, Finn wrestling the dead worker out of the driver's seat. Vance shoved the key into the ignition and slammed the gas pedal down just as the copper roots slammed into the undercarriage. The truck roared forward, tearing itself free from the initial anchor roots, leaving scorched rubber and shredded root fibers behind. Finn, the pumping station is our best guess, but if he's using the power lines, Vance shouted over the engine noise, he's already there. He's going to contaminate the water supply. Ramirez, now riding shotgun, pointed a shaking finger at the dashboard display. The utility truck's GPS was highlighted, showing a flashing route icon. The destination was not the service station the worker was headed to. It was flashing a single, isolated point 10 miles away, the Blackwood Creek pumping station. The gardener had already hijacked the worker's route, drawing him, and subsequently, them, toward his next target. The escape was just the next, terrifying phase of the plan. Vance slammed the accelerator, pushing the stolen EPC truck past its limit. They were racing not against time, but against a spreading consciousness. The gardener had used the power grid to direct the truck, leading them toward the Blackwood Creek pumping station, the hub of the county's water infrastructure. Finn, already on the satellite phone, was barking orders to Captain Hayes, frantically explaining the situation and the immediate need for a full shutdown of the water grid. He's targeting the supply. The entire county has to be isolated from that system now. The drive was a blur of darkness and paranoia. Every flickering streetlight, every silent home they passed, felt like a potential point of infection. "Doyle, check the truck's telemetry," Vance ordered. "Can you trace the route the gardener set? Is he actively controlling the vehicle now?" Doyle frantically tapped the EPC's onboard diagnostics. "The route is locked in, Sergeant. It's an automated service call, but the destination, it's the station. And I'm picking up a massive thermal signature spike there now. It's like the house's fever, but 10 times hotter." The pumping station came into view, a low, blocky structure made of cinder blocks, surrounded by a chain-link fence. There were no lights on, but an eerie, pulsing copper-red glow emanated from the underground pipes that snaked into the building. Vance skidded the truck to a stop 50 yards from the fence. They piled out, weapons drawn. "He's moved his main body," Finn said, his voice quiet. "The house was just the cocoon. This is the factory." They approached the chain-link fence. It wasn't locked. It was open, not breached, but welded open. The metal posts had been fused, and the wire meshing was smooth, blackened, and strangely yielding, like soft charcoal. Inside, the pumping station building was eerily silent. The red glow was strongest where the main water intake pipe disappeared into the earth. "Vance, Olson, cover the entrance. Ramirez, Doyle, check the perimeter for any secondary structures," Finn commanded, pulling out a handful of plastic explosives, a relic from his former career in the tactical unit. "We blow the main intake pipe. If we sever the connection, we stop the spread." As they moved toward the cinder block building, a sound echoed from the deep, concrete tunnels beneath them, the low, resonant hum they had heard at the Miller farmhouse. This time, it was amplified, vibrating through the soles of their boots, rattling the remaining glass in the window frames. The gardener appeared, standing not inside the building, but atop a massive, above-ground water tank 30 yards away. He was covered in more of the copper fluid, and the small, delicate spade he carried now glowed with a fierce, pulsating red light. He was surrounded by a cloud of the yellow-white vapor that had smelled of ether. "Welcome, Sergeant Vance," the voice of Mr. Miller resonated, amplified by the metal tank. "You are exactly on time. I've finished the preparations. The whole county will be quiet soon. And clean. It is a masterpiece of plumbing." The gardener raised the glowing spade. He drove it into the side of the massive metal water tank. A sound of grinding metal followed, and the tank began to weep. Not water, but the dense, copper-red fluid, which quickly began to contaminate the water below. The infection was now entering the reservoir. "Finn! He's contaminating the main supply!" Vance shouted, firing 3 quick slugs from his rifle at the figure. Again, a translucent membrane flickered into existence around the gardener, absorbing the heavy lead slugs with a dull thunk. "Target the medium, not the subject!" Vance screamed. "The tank! Blow the tank!" Finn ignored the danger, racing toward the intake pipe, setting his explosives. Vance and Olson fired concentrated bursts at the huge metal tank, aiming to breach it below the gardener's feet. The bullets pinged uselessly off the reinforced steel. Ramirez, seeing the futility of the attack, grabbed the last functional flare gun from Doyle's kit. "Thermal shock. Hit the bottom." Ramirez fired the flare gun, aiming not at the gardener, but at the bottom edge of the metal tank, directly where the copper fluid was leaking out. The flare struck the seam, igniting the fluid and sending a ribbon of searing green and orange flame along the base of the tank. The flame didn't just burn the fluid, it superheated the metal. The thermal shock was immediate. The massive tank groaned, and the gardener, screaming in agony, was momentarily distracted. His protective membrane flickered, becoming momentarily visible as a shimmering, unstable haze. "Now, Finn! Now!" Vance yelled. Finn detonated the explosives. Kaboom! The main intake pipe, a foot in diameter, was instantly severed, blasted into twisted shrapnel. A torrent of raw, pressurized water erupted from the pipe, dousing the area and momentarily collapsing the noxious vapor cloud. The moment the pipe broke, the gardener let out a final, ear-splitting shriek that was neither Mr. Miller nor his own, but a raw, tearing sound of immense structural pain. He lost his footing and slid down the side of the tank, collapsing into the darkness behind it. The intense heat signature on Doyle's thermal monitor immediately vanished. The humming stopped. The pulsing red glow in the underground pipes faded into absolute darkness. Silence returned, absolute and terrifying. The core was severed. Finn, the building. The source is in the structure. Vance yelled, knowing the fight wasn't over. The gardener was likely making a final stand within the interconnected pipes and valves of the station itself. They advanced on the cinderblock building, the air thick with steam and ozone. As they reached the entrance, the last thing they heard was Captain Hayes's voice crackling over the satellite phone. "We are on lockdown. All Blackwood Creek water supply is shut down. We're sending in the military. ETA 1 hour." They were alone for the climax. Vance kicked the door to the Blackwood Creek pumping station open. The interior was a damp, echoing labyrinth of concrete, pipes, and metal valves. The rhythmic clicking of the valves was gone, replaced by the continuous drip of water and the metallic tang of the copper residue. The copper-red glow was now faint, localized only in the largest intake valve near the back wall. The air was thick, still smelling of ozone and metal. "Spread out. Olsen, cover that central column. Ramirez, stick close to Finn. Doyle, keep tracking any heat signatures. I want to know where that thing is," Vance commanded, raising his rifle. They moved cautiously past the silent, massive machinery, pumps and filtration systems, all coated in a sticky film of copper fluid. The floor was slippery, and the pipes running along the ceiling were swollen and pulsing faintly, like exhausted veins. They found Lieutenant Finn at the central control panel, planting his remaining block of plastic explosive on the main water filtration valve. "We take out this valve, we isolate the entire system from the grid," Finn said, setting the timer to 20 minutes. Suddenly, a sound emerged from the large, dark drain in the center of the concrete floor, the one designed to handle overflow. It wasn't the gardener's voice, it was a high-pitched, resonant whistling. The sound didn't come from the pipe, but from the air itself. Vance turned, aiming his rifle at the drain. A thick, gelatinous column of black, spongy moss, identical to the material on the staircase, surged upward. It quickly solidified into the form of the young man, the gardener, dripping water and copper fluid. He looked exhausted, his movements jerky, and his skin was covered in weeping sores from the thermal shock of the fire and the sudden, explosive destruction of his root system. "You are destructive, Sergeant Vance," the gardener whispered, his voice weak and raw, no longer using Mr. Miller's resonance. "But all systems have an overflow. And the material finds the path of least resistance." He lifted his hand, and from the wall behind him, a small, organic cannon, a bulbous, copper-colored growth, swiveled into position, aiming directly at Finn and the explosives. Behind the console, Vance yelled, firing a quick, controlled burst at the gardener. The membrane flickered instantly, but this time, it was translucent and unstable, struggling to contain the force. The slugs hit the gardener's chest, throwing him backward and tearing through his ragged uniform, revealing patches of unnaturally pale, fungal skin beneath. Ramirez and Olsen opened fire, pinning the wounded gardener down. But the organic cannon on the wall was still charging, glowing with a deep, furious red light. "He's going to fire!" Olsen screamed. Doyle, seeing the charging weapon, grabbed a heavy, rusted crescent wrench from a nearby workbench. Ignoring the danger, he leaped onto the central pipe structure, racing toward the organic cannon on the wall. He brought the heavy wrench down with desperate force, smashing the bulbous growth. The cannon exploded, not outward, but inward, with a sickening squelch. A torrent of viscous, black fluid erupted from the wound, dousing Doyle, who cried out, staggering back. The distraction gave Vance the opening. He raced toward the wounded gardener, who was trying to pull himself toward the drain, his escape route. Vance kicked the glowing spade from his hand, sending it skittering across the concrete. "It's over!" Vance yelled, aiming his rifle at the gardener's head. The gardener stopped struggling. He looked up at Vance, his eyes wide and dark, not with fear, but with a strange, sorrowful triumph. "The pipes are cold, Vance. And they sing to me. The water, it only needed a taste. A small sample of the final work. He gave a final, desperate heave. He didn't jump into the drain. Instead, he lunged toward the main water line that was still spurting water from the severed pipe. He grabbed the rough, broken edge of the metal. The moment his fingers touched the pipe, the remnants of his body, his clothes, his limbs, his hair, didn't bleed or break. They turned instantly into a swirling torrent of the copper-red fluid and black moss. The entire body dissolved into the liquid, which was immediately sucked down the severed water line, into the vast, interconnected network of tunnels and pipes that spanned the county. The gardener was gone. He had not been killed. He had deliberately retreated into the circulatory system he had established. Finn's timer beeped insistently. 10 minutes left. The team stood in stunned silence, watching the last traces of the copper fluid disappear down the line. "He's in the water system," Olsen whispered, horrified. "He's everywhere the water goes." "Not yet," Vance corrected, lowering his rifle, his adrenaline crashing. "He only got a taste in." Hayes shut the supply down before he finished the job. Finn ran to the filtration valve and pulled the detaching wire from the explosive. "We don't need the bomb. We need to seal the system." They worked frantically, sealing the severed intake pipe with emergency clamps and quick-setting foam from the maintenance closet, creating an impenetrable barrier. As the sun began to rise, the silence was finally broken by the distant but distinct sound of military helicopters approaching. Captain Hayes had come through. They walked out of the pumping station and looked back at the house, now just a quiet, innocuous cinderblock structure. Doyle, still covered in the black residue, spoke softly. He called it the overflow. He escaped into the system. It's latent now. Dormant. Waiting for the pressure to build again. Vance looked down the road,